For our virtual attendees, please go back to the main agenda and select this session to join in. For those of you here at the Time Center, sit tight. Andrew will join us on stage in a moment. Andrew King is the founder of AKA and FLDWRK. Andrew has been recognized nationally and internationally as a leader in design excellence, applied design research, teaching, and cultural discourse. He has been named one of Canada's design leaders and has received 4 Canadian Architect Awards of Excellence. Please welcome Andrew to share his ideas for radical new approaches to ecological, social, and economic transformation of underused space.
I'm going to start with is this loud enough, right? I'm going to start with, I think, an apology and a warning. I went through this presentation with my partner a couple of days ago, and she said, I said, it's an Ignite talk. And she said, that really sounds more like therapy. So if it comes across as therapy, I apologize, but hopefully it's reasonably entertaining because it's also going to be full of lies. I was also okay with that. I was okay with making a journey, coming from Montreal to New York and having a fairly anonymous but very public therapy session. That was cool. Until I got here this morning and I realized I know a bunch of people and I've got 2 really old friends here, so they will be able to identify the lies, but we'll work through. John Brown is one of them. So I wasn't nervous at all about this talk until I realized John was here. Little bit, AKA, oh, I'm going to go back. AKA Andrew King. This is a fairly significant practice that's been going on for about 30 years with lots of different comings and goings, with collaborations with large practices, different work within large practices, but some very large projects, some very interesting cultural projects. But what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today is AKA FLDWRK, which is the practice as research and design rather than design and research. The reason Angela, my partner, who was here actually last year at this time talking about one of our projects with me, thought that it was therapy is because it all seems unfinished. So this is going to be, rather than one big project, rather than lots of built projects around the world, this is just going to be a bunch of murmurs, whispers, screams around probably 25 or 30 unfinished projects, which I'm hoping will frame the last 15 to 20 years 25 years, the last 50 years, how about that, of an architectural, or of a design practice. We're consumed by words, and one of the projects that's underway, again, quite unfinished, is a book project around the work, 30 years of work. And what we realized, I hope you can see that, what we realized was it's more about a series of specific words that have consumed us: politics, fetish, speculation, ephemerality, itinerant practice. But that actually, when we started to build the table of contents for the book, we realized it's actually maybe a film. That actually, we don't do a book, we should do a movie, and that movie has maybe an animation quality that could be interesting. I apologize to John. I created this slide for a keynote I did for him last year. But this is really talking about what the practice is trying to do. It's been across Canada and across Europe. I apologize. We've managed to avoid the US. It involves a series of 4 or 5 research streams that have linked across those cities. It's involved AKA as a long-term, small, speculative practice that has come in and out, has had residents and no residents. So I can look here. And then there's academia. I've been teaching pretty much consistently for 30 years. I have a professor of practice appointment right now at McGill University and at the University of Calgary. And then there's a large project component. I worked with Zaha Hadid, Brian McKay Lyons years ago. Worked with some large firms in Canada and the US in their Canadian practice. And then a commitment to design awards and dissemination. Where we are now, given that we've gone through a series of thresholds, what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is in a practice that really has a bunch of questions, 4 or 5 significant questions that each has a kind of offshoot. This microphone's a little heavy, so if I drop my book in an emergency, you'll understand why. I'm going to read just 2 paragraphs of this. AKA FLDWRK is the convergence of research and design collective committed to continual evolution of design practice as a force for change. aka FieldWRK, at the intersection of research and practice. Projects become laboratory spaces for exploring, prototyping, experimenting, radical hypotheses in the face of evolving context. The practice is the project. And that's something we've been speaking a lot about in various forums these days, the fact that practice has to respond. And practice, for me, is art, it's curation, it's some fashion work, it's books, teaching, films, and of course, buildings. We have these. This is all very fluid. Everything is changing. I was reading this text in what they call the green room. It's actually red. But I actually sat there and I said to Jasmine, I think I disagree with some of this text. And it's actually my text. Anyway, there's six apertures for fieldwork. The titles I agree with. Design is activism. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Heavy abundance, commons, radical obligations, cities in crisis, and post-digitality. These are all manifestos. They all have mini manifestos within, and the big manifesto is the title of this talk, which is Fire Seed Soil, and the title that I gave it on my online presence, Heavy Abundance. Design as activism is pretty much embedded in the manifesto for fieldwork I showed you. Heavy abundance, we're going to talk about specifically, but it's really about learning how Canada as a place can respond to the crises that are in place within the world, and what Canada both has to offer in many ways and what we haven't leveraged. The commons is that fundamental commitment to public space in many ways. Radical obligation is many things, but right now it's a commitment to health and wellness and architecture. It's a commitment. I've done a few large healthcare projects, and it's taking those ideas and then manifesting them or leveraging them in smaller scale projects that are trying to make a change. Cities in crisis is pretty clear. We've had several talks today that talked about the importance of a manifesto around how we need to re-evaluate our cities. And then post-digitality, I really don't understand what that means. It's an intern in my office, really thinks it's important. So I have a kind of view of what it is. And I'll try and explain mine. I don't think it's his, though. So these all have projects right now. Design as activism. We have a series of projects on the board right now that deal with new communities within Canada, deal with diasporic issues. Heavy abundance is a major project right now, a series of projects, but one of which has driven the sort of identity of the work. The commons, we have a whole series of public space projects, whether they're public spaces within university campuses or public spaces in downtown. Last year when we were here, we spoke about Place de Montréal, which is a major public space in Montreal that really tries to recalibrate the city around inclusionary strategies. Radical obligation, some work with the Lamar Foundation, which is an organization for adults with autism and finding housing solutions. And we're doing some work with long-term care, innovative long-term care strategies in Toronto. Cities in crisis is both Calgary and Beirut. I know they're very distinct, but the Calgary work we're doing with the City of Calgary and the University of Calgary, and Beirut I'm doing with 4 students at McGill University as part of their graduate work. And then post-digitality, I've already explained. Not really. The idea of design as activism is really the driver. Fundamentally, in the work that we've done over the last few years, working with communities, whether it's the Tamil community, many indigenous communities, working on projects where the mandate is really to create resilient and inclusive understandings of the world. And also, even the large-scale projects, the housing projects, using public space in innovative ways, the hospitals, actually radically changing the place of art in a healthcare environment. So the idea that design, even insidiously, can inform a kind of activist agenda. So there's a few notes here. Design is a form of activism in all project fieldwork has engaged in various degrees. The idea that there's different ways in which we delve into design of activism. There's a project we're doing right now with the Tamil community. It's a cultural center and a community center in Scarborough. And I was working closely with the client, who's become a good friend. And we had a very emotional conversation where at some point, after all these conversations around program, what could happen here, he said, this building is a response to the war in my homeland. And there's no way that anybody's going to destroy this building like they've destroyed our temples, our places of worship. So this notion that design is activism, a radical activism, is important. This all started, really, this notion of a pan-Canadian understanding with a project called Trans-Canada. And this is a very Canadian project. This is a proposition for Venice Biennial submission that we put together. It's very, very Canadian in the sense that it's just about looking at the landscape. Looking at the landscape in an interesting way, saying there's critical topographies. We have lots of partners, myself, Angela Silver, Steve Fye from Carleton, Chris McDonald, Shauna McCabe. But really, in the end, it became a proposition for an exhibition that said, how do we document Canada? How do we actually deal with it as a place of vastness, and how do we measure that vastness, that banality, that excitement? How do we actually start to talk about that abundance? And it was the first proposition through all this work that the word abundance came together. And we looked at methodologies for mapping and presentation. We didn't get this submission. We didn't win. We were shortlisted, but we didn't win it. But it really became the armature then for the next series of projects. It was really generated by a couple of years ago. This was during COVID. We were invited to do a conversation with Marcus Ferris from Dezeen. It was, I think, the last project or second to last project before he passed away, where he asked us to do a Canadian design. What is Canadian design? This very neutral, very normative thing. So we had a nice conversation. These are three very nice people, for sure, talking about what Canadian design could be. Leslie Jen had just published her book on Canadian design culture. Dave Fortin had just got an appointment as a major professor at Waterloo. But in the end, Marcus challenged us. He goes, no, what is it about? What does it mean? And I said, well, there is a manifesto. And he said, what's the manifesto? And I said, I don't know. And then he put this on his webpage and says, Andrew King says, and I'm not sure if I did, but we certainly took up the gauntlet. And we said, pan-Canadian design can be something important. Still don't agree with pan-Canadian design, but I do agree that there's something that we can give to the world. There's a manifesto around what's happening in Canada and how we're functioning and responding in Canada that can be really important, and that is heavy abundance. I'm going to give full and complete credit. My 22-year-old intern, Emma Fong-Lasange, came up with this in the middle of the night. She texted me and said, I think it's called this. And I said, you're right, it's called that. And the idea of heavy abundance, like the work we were doing for the Venice submission, started off as a kind of visual essay. How do we talk about Canadian abundance? How do we talk about Canadian landscape? How do we talk about cultural influences? How do we fundamentally take values, indigenous values around the word obligation, and actually frame it? So the first exercises were sort of concrete poems within visual languages. But in the end, it really became a sort of three-paragraph essay. Heavy abundance is a viable future. The perpetual need to grow and innovate must remain, but in response to the environmental degradation and social injustice. And the social injustice is something that's incredibly important. To reconceptualize this abundance through provocative and radical responses to normative modes of thinking and making, and that's normative modes of practice. Leveraging it as a mechanism for swift and powerful change, shifting from consumption to stewardship, which is from profligate waste to careful curation, from privilege to obligation. And obligation is a word that I've seen Matthew Hickey, who's an Indigenous architect in Toronto, use often, and we've heavily borrowed it. So these are the series of images that became the sort of first mechanism for heavy abundance. The first one is more experiential. The second is trying to look at the mechanisms, the idea of value, the idea of Canada as a country full of, I'm not sure, I forget the word now, but it's full of stuff that people take away and make other stuff from. And how that can become these notions of physical beauty. So the manifesto itself is very much, again, it's an unfinished project, and each paragraph of this is an unfinished project, but there are certain things that are worth reading. I think I've read most of this. What I really like is Canada exists as a dance between diverse cultural constructs and its immense natural abundance. Canadian design is a choreography of said whirl. I love that word whirl, and I think if a practice, or the next 10, 15, 20, 50 years of a practice can be a whirl, I think we're on the right path. Motherland. This is driven by lots of conversations with partners who have a really strong understanding of Indigenous architecture and Indigenous culture. But the land is our vessel, our water, the thread which unites it together. If our existence depends on the graciousness of our earth, the importance of our immediate ecosystem heightens. Constructed landscape. This reaches back to the work that we did for the Venice submission. It goes back to the history of Canada in the way the world saw Canada as a colonized, romanticized context in which a Gothic or a neo-European architecture can emerge. But that constructed image of landscape can become more appropriate and more of our place as it exists. The word diasporic is one that we've been pushing around a lot right now, working with the Tamil community, putting together a series of submissions around new communities that are gaining traction in Canada. Canada has a history of that world. Canada must be radically of the land. Absolutely fundamental to our world is its place on the land. And it must point to a future. It has its obligations. And it must lead radically. That's the manifesto as it exists. It's undercooked. It's got a hook, but it's undercooked. It's like a lot of Cure songs. Some projects that I'll talk about that are touching on these things, as I'm out of time now, is the Commons. This is the Place de Montréal. Audrey Girard is here from my former studio. She's worked on this project. And I spoke with Angela about this project last year. It really is a project that, from a Commons point of view, really tries to recalibrate the city. Radical obligations. This is the work we're doing with Lamar Foundation. It's about creating an environment in which adults with autism can find a haptic, poetic experience within their space. Post-digitality, love the image, don't know what it is. And then cities in crisis. I'm going to finish with this. I've got 4 students right now at McGill that are working in different ways on the post-explosion of Beirut, which is very interesting, looking at the way art can help knit the city back together. But this is work that we're doing with the University of Calgary, a school that John Brown is the dean of, Fire Seed Soil Climate Haven Cities, where we're really trying to change the way in which a city that's gone through radical metamorphosis and has some interesting histories in terms of its economic viability can then be challenged to create a new identity for itself with some very, very aggressive ideological positions. For instance, there's a sentence here that what does it mean to have too much space while on stolen land? To envision a future of a so-called city of Calgary that requires critical acknowledgement of the complicity of design and designers in aiding the growth and agenda of capitalist elites. If you're in a context where you can have students build this kind of positioning of architectural language around the future of our cities and of our country and of our world, then I think we're in a happy place. This is work from Vivian and Sam's proposition around that work, and then this is Canada. I welcome you all to come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Coming up next, a panel discussion on making commitments to cleaner, more resilient, and regenerative communities. For our virtual attendees, please go back to the main agenda and select this session to join in.